Hello and welcome to LSAT Logic Applied. I'm your host, Andrew Leahy, an assistant teaching professor of law at Drexel Klein School of Law. This is a short format podcast where I take the tools from LSAT logical reasoning, assumptions, flaws, causation, strength and weaken, and apply them to real-world claims in the news, science, and public discourse. For those that don't know, the LSAT is the law school admission test, a standardized exam designed to assess logical reasoning, analytical thinking, and reading comprehension for law school applicants. It's a high-stakes test with a unique focus on how arguments work and how they fall apart. The LSAT is owned and administered by the Law School Admission Council, or LSAC. I don't claim any affiliation or ownership. I'm just here to teach the logic. You don't need to be studying for the LSAT to follow along. The point is to learn how to spot weak or incomplete reasoning in everyday life, the same kind of reasoning the LSAT trains you to attack under time pressure. Today's episode looks at a corporate press release about hydration and asks a very LSAT-style question. When does defining a problem become a way of creating one? Here's the background. Gatorade recently announced what it calls a, quote, transformational new era for hydration. The company claims that more than 150 million Americans feel dehydrated each week, that hydration is widely misunderstood, and that its science-backed products can help people hydrate, quote, better, faster, or longer than water. The pitch is broader than sports. Gatorade is explicitly moving from elite athletic performance into everyday life, morning routines, long work days, even travel. The implicit argument, once you strip away the branding, looks something like this. Millions of people are experiencing dehydration. Hydration is confusing and difficult to manage. Gatorade has science-backed solutions that outperform water. Therefore, consumers should rely on products like Gatorade to meet their hydration needs. That is exactly the kind of argument the LSAT wants you to slow down and inspect. The structure of the argument looks roughly like this. A large number of Americans report feeling dehydrated. Hydration is complex and poorly understood. Gatorade products are designed based on decades of research to improve hydration outcomes. Therefore, consumers need more structured, product-based hydration solutions like Gatorade. Now, to be fair, none of these premises are obviously absurd. Hydration does matter. People do get confused by health messaging, and sports drinks were originally designed for specific physiological conditions involving electrolyte loss. But the conclusion that everyday consumers broadly need these products does not automatically follow. It is still an inference, and that inference has vulnerabilities, quite a few of them. First, we have definitional drift. What exactly counts as dehydrated? Start with the headline claim. 150 million Americans, quote, feel dehydrated. That sounds alarming, but on the LSAT, you immediately ask, what does that mean? There is a difference between subjectively feeling thirsty or fatigued and clinically meaningful dehydration. If the argument quietly shifts between those two definitions, it inflates the size of the problem, and this is a classic LSAT flaw, equivocation. If feeling dehydrated includes ordinary, temporary sensations, then the premise may be true, but the conclusion becomes overstated. And then we have comparative claims without conditions, things like better than water. The claim that Gatorade products hydrate better than water. Better for whom and under what conditions? For elite athletes in high heat with significant electrolyte loss, that may be well supported. But the argument extends that conclusion to everyday scenarios, walking, commuting, working, and that's a leap. On the LSAT, this is a necessary assumption problem. The argument assumes that the conditions under which Gatorade outperforms water are common enough to justify widespread use. If that assumption fails, the conclusion weakens. And then we have manufactured complexity, this idea that hydration is confusing. The press release emphasizes that hydration has become difficult to navigate. The consumers face a crowded, confusing marketplace, but that raises a subtle question. Is hydration inherently complex, or is it being framed that way? If the problem is defined as, quote, confusing, and the solution is a branded system that clarifies it, you may be looking at a self-serving premise. On the LSAT, this resembles a circular or problem-solution flaw. You define a problem, you offer your product as the solution, and you conclude the product is necessary, without independent evidence that the problem exists in that form at all. And finally, we have vague appeals to science, the repeated reference to, quote, 60 years of hydration science. That sounds authoritative, but what's missing? We don't get specific study conditions, population details, magnitude of effects, or clear boundaries for when the conclusions apply. On the LSAT, this is a form of appeal to authority without specificity. The argument gains credibility from the idea of science without giving enough detail to actually evaluate it. The natural LSAT question thus becomes, what evidence would actually support the claim, and what evidence might undermine it? To strengthen the argument, we would want to know whether everyday consumers outside of athletic or high exertion contexts actually experience measurable benefits from these products over water, whether the 150 million figure corresponds to clinically meaningful dehydration rather than general discomfort or misinterpretation of normal bodily signals, and whether independent peer-reviewed research supports the broad better than water claim across typical daily activities. On the other hand, the argument would be weakened if most people labeled as dehydrated are simply experiencing normal transient thirst. The benefits of electrolyte drinks are limited to narrow conditions like intense exercise or illness, or the perception of confusion is driven more by marketing than by underlying physiological complexity. In other words, the key issue is not whether hydration matters, because it clearly does. The question is whether the problem is being defined and expanded in a way that makes the solution seem more necessary than it really is. Obviously, this episode is really about a core LSAT lesson and not Gatorade. It's about how arguments are built not just on facts, but on how those facts are defined and framed. Here, the move is subtle but powerful. A broad, somewhat ambiguous condition, the idea of feeling hydrated, gets scaled into a national problem. That problem is described as complex, and then a structured, product-based solution is offered as the answer. Each step may be plausible on its own, but the logic connecting them deserves scrutiny. So the right LSAT questions are we using consistent definitions? Are comparative claims being applied beyond their proper scope? Is the problem independently established or constructed to fit the solution? And does the evidence actually match the breadth of the conclusion? Because in real-world arguments, as on the LSAT, the most persuasive claims often rely not on false premises, but on small, defensible steps that add up to a much stronger conclusion than the evidence alone can actually support. With that, I thank you for listening to LSAT Logic Applied. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more short episodes where we apply clean logic to messy, real-world claims. See you next time.